The Kansas dust was a fine, choking powder that settled on everything, a constant reminder of the world shrinking around Eleanor Pierce. It coated the sills of the schoolhouse where her father taught, dulling the spines of his precious books. It settled in the prim lace at her own throat, a gritty testament to the life laid out for her. At 23, she was an object of gentle pity in their small community, a spinster in the making. Her prospects, like the summer fields, had withered under a sun of polite expectations and quiet judgments. She was too tall, they whispered, her gaze too direct. Her mind, sharpened on her father's library, was considered less an asset and more a peculiarity, like a six-fingered cat. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, carried by a boy whose face was already smudged with that same ubiquitous dust. It was from the Arizona Territory, the paper thin and brittle, smelling of distance and something wild she could not name. Her uncle, her mother's adventurous, seldom seen brother, was dead. He had been a man who chose the horizon over the hearth, a choice Eleanor was beginning to understand with an ache that felt like a physical sickness. He had left her, his only living relative of consequence. What little he had, a trading post, the letter specified, situated on the very edge of the Navajo lands, a place called Two Coyotes. Her father, a man whose spine was as straight and unbending as the ruler he used on unruly boys, read the letter over her shoulder. His lips thinned. He saw only destitution and danger, a woman alone in a godless land full of savages and scoundrels. He spoke of duty, of her place here, caring for him in his twilight years, of the quiet dignity in accepting one's lot. But Eleanor heard a different call. In the words Arizona Territory, she heard not an ending, but a beginning. It was a summons from a world made of rock and heat and sky, a world that did not care for lace collars or whispered judgments. The dust of Kansas was the dust of a life already lived, of a story already written for her. The dust of Arizona, she imagined, would be different. It would be the dust of creation. The decision settled in her not like a choice, but like a remembering of who she was meant to be. She would go. The arguments were terrible. Her father's quiet disappointment a heavier blow than any raised voice could ever be. But for the first time, Eleanor felt the hard, unyielding bedrock of her own will. She packed a single trunk with practical dresses, her mother's locket, and a surprising number of books her father would have deemed unsuitable for the frontier. The journey west was a long, shuddering sermon on the vastness of the continent. The green-ordered plains of her home gave way to rolling, sun-baked hills, then to a starker country that seemed to flay the softness from a person. The air grew thin and dry, and the sky became a relentless, infinite blue. Fellow travelers, families in search of fortune, and solitary men with haunted eyes looked at her with a mixture of curiosity and concern. A lone woman, traveling to a place most were fleeing. She kept to herself, her chin held high, her gaze fixed on the brutal, beautiful landscape unfolding outside the stagecoach window. This was not a world that offered comfort. It demanded strength, and Eleanor found, to her own surprise, that she had reserves of it she had never been allowed to test. The stage left her at a dusty crossroads with a single, heat-warped signpost. One arm pointed toward the town of Prescott, the other, weathered and barely legible, pointed down a rutted track toward Two Coyotes. The trading post was another 5 miles. The driver told her, his eyes lingering on her with a professional sort of pity. He wished her luck in a tone that suggested she would need all of it. She paid a man with a rickety buckboard to take her and her trunk the final distance. The silence of the desert was the first thing that struck her. It was not an absence of sound. It was a presence, a living thing made of the whisper of wind over sand, the skittering of unseen lizards, and the distant cry of a hawk. Saguaro cacti stood like silent, multi-armed sentinels against the horizon. The earth was red, the color of a fresh wound, and the mountains in the distance were the bruised purple of a fading twilight. It was a land of violent beauty, and it terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. When the trading post came into view, her heart sank. It was not just neglected. It felt surrendered. The adobe walls were crumbling, the wooden sign creaking on a single hinge. Shutters hung askew, like broken teeth in a grimacing mouth. The corral was empty, its gate swinging in the hot breeze. It looked as though her uncle had simply walked away one day, and the desert had immediately begun its patient work of reclaiming what belonged to it. The buckboard driver unloaded her trunk onto the porch, accepted his payment with another dubious glance, and left her in a cloud of red dust. Eleanor stood alone, the sole occupant of her new kingdom of ruin. For a moment, the weight of her decision pressed down on her. The faces of her Kansas neighbors, smug in their certainty of her failure, swam before her eyes. She took a deep breath, the air searing her lungs. It smelled of dust and creosote and something else, something faintly metallic and unsettling. She pushed the heavy wooden door open. The inside was a cavern of shadows and dust motes dancing in the few shafts of light that pierced the gloom. A long counter ran the length of the main room, coated in a thick layer of grime. Shelves stood mostly empty, save for a few tins of beans and a scattering of forgotten tools. It was a place of ghosts, of transactions long past. She walked through the main room to the small living quarters in the back, a simple cot, a table with one chair, a cold fireplace. Everything was covered in the same fine dust. It was a spare, lonely existence her uncle had led. A deep sense of unease began to creep over her. The silence in here was different from the living silence of the desert outside. This was a dead, watchful quiet. She noticed a door at the far end of the main room, leading to what must be the storeroom. It was slightly ajar. The strange, metallic smell was stronger here. She pushed the door open, her hand trembling slightly. The storeroom was dark, the air thick and stagnant. Light from the main room cut a sharp rectangle onto the dirt floor, illuminating sacks of flour slumped against the wall, barrels of what she guessed was salted pork, and piles of Navajo blankets, their vibrant colors muted by the shadows, and something else, a shape on the floor, half hidden behind a stack of crates. At first, she thought it was another pile of blankets, but it was too still, too dark. A low sound, a ragged exhalation of breath, reached her ears. It was the sound of pain. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. Her father's warnings about scoundrels and vagrants screamed in her mind. She should run. She should bar the door and wait for someone, anyone, to come along the empty road. But her feet, guided by an impulse stronger than fear, moved forward. She stepped into the storeroom, her eyes struggling to adjust to the gloom. The shape resolved itself into the form of a man. He was lying on his side, his face turned away from her. He was Native American, his skin the color of burnished copper, his black hair long and matted with dirt and something dark and wet. He wore buckskin trousers and was naked from the waist up. His back and shoulders were a canvas of muscle and sinew, even in repose, and they were covered in blood. A dark, ugly gash ran from his left shoulder down his side, a ragged tear in his flesh that was crusted and angry-looking. Flies buzzed lazily around the wound. His breathing was shallow, punctuated by that same rattling groan. He was not just injured, he was dying. Eleanor stood frozen, her mind a whirlwind of terror and a strange, fierce compassion. This was a man, a human being, bleeding to death on the floor of her property. She saw a rifle lying on the floor a few feet from his outstretched hand. He was a warrior, then a Navajo, judging by the turquoise bracelet on his wrist. A savage. Her father would have called him. She took another step closer. She could see his face now, in profile. High cheekbones, a strong jaw, a mouth set in a grim line even in unconsciousness. He was younger than she had first thought, perhaps not yet 30. A deep line was carved between his brows, a permanent mark of pain or concentration. Despite the blood and the dirt, there was a stark, undeniable beauty to him, the kind of beauty forged in hardship and sun. not in parlors and drawing rooms. She knelt beside him, her practical cotton dress brushing the dirt floor. She reached out a hesitant hand, not to the wound, but to his forehead. It was burning with fever. His skin was dry and hot, and a tremor ran through his powerful frame. He was burning from the inside out. The infection was already in him. The decision was not even a conscious thought. It was a certainty that rose from that same deep well of will she had discovered in Kansas. She could not let him die. Leaving him here would be a kind of murder. She looked at his still form, at the proud, harsh lines of his face, and saw not a savage, but a man at the mercy of a cruel fate. Her uncle had left her this place, this ruin. Perhaps he had left her this man, too. The thought was absurd, yet it settled in her with a strange sense of rightness, with a resolve that surprised her. She stood up. First, water. She found the well out back, the rope dry and stiff, the bucket heavy. She hauled it up, her soft hands already chafing, and carried the cool, precious water inside. She found clean rags in a chest in the back room, tearing them into strips. She knelt beside him again, this time with purpose. Gently, so gently, she began to clean the wound. It was worse than she had thought, deep and festering. He flinched at her touch, a low growl rumbling in his chest, but he did not wake. She worked methodically, her fear receding as the immediate, practical needs of the task took over. She washed away the dried blood, her stomach turning at the sight but her hands remaining steady. She had seen her uncle tend to injured farm animals, had read of battlefield medicine in books. It was a poor education for this, but it was all she had. She bathed his face, pushing the matted hair back from his forehead. A long, thin scar cut across his right eyebrow, a silver line against his dark skin. It was an old wound, healed and pale. She wondered what kind of life he had lived, a life that etched such marks onto a man. As she worked, a strange intimacy grew in the dusty silence of the storeroom. She was touching this stranger in a way she had never touched another man, her hands learning the shape of him, the heat of his fever, the solid strength of his bones beneath the skin. She felt a flicker of something she could not name, a dizzying mix of fear and fascination. He was all that her world had taught her to fear, a wild, dangerous man from a world of violence. Yet here he was, helpless under her hands, and she felt not revulsion, but a fierce, protective instinct. She forced a little water between his cracked lips. He swallowed weakly, his throat working. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. For hours she worked, bathing his skin to bring the fever down, cleaning the wound as best she could, covering it with a clean cloth. The sun began to set, painting the desert in hues of orange and rose and flooding the trading post with a soft, forgiving light. She dragged a mattress from the cot in the back room and, with a strength she did not know she possessed, managed to roll him onto it, his weight a dead, heavy thing. She covered him with one of the Navajo blankets from the pile, its geometric patterns a stark contrast to his still form. As darkness fell, she lit a single lantern, its golden glow pushing back the shadows. She sat on an overturned crate beside him, the rifle now propped safely against the far wall. The silence returned. Deeper now in the night, she watched the slow, shallow rise and fall of his chest. He was still alive. For now, that was enough. She had come to the desert seeking freedom, seeking a life of her own making. She had not expected that life to begin here, in a dusty storeroom, with the fate of a wounded warrior resting entirely in her hands. The desert had given her a challenge, and she had accepted. What would come of it? She did not know. But as she watched him breathe in the flickering lantern light, Eleanor Pierce knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she was no longer in Kansas. The fever did not break for 2 more days. They were a blur of hauling water, of bathing his hot skin with cool rags, and of sleeplessness. The lantern burned through the night, a tiny star of defiance in the vast, dark desert. In that small circle of light, Eleanor learned the landscape of him. She learned the rhythm of his breathing, the way his muscles would clench in a fever dream, the faint scent of pine and smoke that clung to him even through the sickness. She spoke to him in low tones, not because she thought he could understand, but because the silence felt too much like a tomb. She told him about Kansas, about the flatness of the land and the flatness of her life, her words filling the dusty air with a story he was not meant to hear. On the morning of the third day, she awoke slumped against a crate to find him watching her. His eyes were open. They were the darkest eyes she had ever seen, the color of wet obsidian, and they held an unnerving stillness. There was no fevered glaze in them now, only a sharp, assessing intelligence. Fear, cold and immediate, shot through her. The helpless man was gone. In his place was a warrior, alert and wary. She straightened up, her body stiff and sore. "You are awake," she said, her voice a foolish whisper. He did not reply immediately. His gaze moved from her face, around the storeroom, to the rifle propped against the far wall, and finally down to the clean bandage on his side. He tried to sit up, a sharp hiss of pain escaping his lips. "You should not move," Eleanor said, moving forward instinctively. "Your wound is deep. It is infected." He ignored her, pushing himself up with one arm, his jaw tight. The effort cost him, leaving him pale beneath his copper skin and breathing heavily. He finally settled into a sitting position against the wall, the blanket pooled around his waist. His eyes met hers again. "Where is he?" His voice was a low rasp, rough from disuse. "Where is who?" "The old man, the trader." "My uncle," she clarified. "He passed away. That is why I am here." A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes. He absorbed this information without comment, his gaze once again sweeping over her, taking in her plain dress, her tired face, her hands, which were now calloused and rough. "You did this?" he asked, gesturing to his bandaged side. She nodded. "I cleaned it as best I could. And the fever, I gave you water." He was silent for a long time. So long that Eleanor began to think he would not speak again. His stillness was not empty. It was watchful, a gathering of thoughts. "You should have left me," he said at last. It was not an accusation, but a simple statement of fact. "I could not," she replied, just as simply. That was the beginning of their life together at Two Coyotes. He told her his name was Tahoe. He did not say more, and she did not ask. His recovery was slow, but his strength was formidable. Within a week he was walking, his movement stiff but purposeful. He never spoke of how he had come to be wounded and bleeding in her storeroom, and Eleanor respected his silence. In turn, he did not question her presence in this desolate place. They were two solitary people, washed up on the same shore by different storms. Eleanor set about making the trading post habitable, and then profitable. She scrubbed away years of dust and neglect, her body aching with the unfamiliar labor. She took inventory, finding the shelves more bare than she had realized. She knew then that she could not just pack up and leave. This place was her inheritance, her one chance at a life that was her own. She would make it work. Tahoe watched her, his dark eyes missing nothing. He began to help, his actions speaking far louder than words ever could. He repaired the broken corral gate, his hands surprisingly deft with the worn tools. He rehung the heavy shutters, his quiet strength making the task look easy. He taught her how to find the sweet spot in the well pump to draw water without exhausting herself. They worked in a comfortable silence, developing a rhythm that required few words. One morning, Eleanor was attempting to organize the remaining tins on the shelves, trying to impose a sense of order on the chaos. She had decided on an alphabetical arrangement, a small piece of her father's scholarly world brought to this wild place. Tahoe stood in the doorway, watching her move a tin of peaches for the third time. "The beans do not care if they stand next to the corn," he observed, his voice devoid of judgment but filled with a faint, dry amusement. Eleanor stopped, a flush rising on her cheeks. "It is about order," she explained. feeling the need to defend her logic. It makes things easier to find. He nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. Your world has many rules for things that do not need them. It was not a criticism, but it struck her with the force of a revelation. She looked at the shelves, then at him, standing there so solidly in the morning light, a man who belonged to the red earth and the vast sky. His world had rules, she knew, but they were the rules of the seasons, of the sun and the rain, of life and death. Her rules suddenly seemed flimsy and foolish. As he grew stronger, the Navajo began to come. They would appear out of the heat haze of the desert, materializing as if from the earth itself. At first, they would stop at a distance, their faces impassive, their eyes on the trading post. They were waiting. They were watching. Tahoe would go out to meet them, speaking in their own tongue, his voice a low, melodic murmur that was entirely different from the clipped English he used with her. After these quiet conversations, the people would approach. They brought beautiful woven blankets, intricate silver jewelry, and pottery the color of the sunset. In exchange, they wanted flour, sugar, coffee, and tools. Tahoe became her translator, her broker, her bridge to this other world. He explained the value of the goods, the nuances of the trade. He was scrupulously fair, to her and to his people, and she quickly realized that the success of Two Coyotes depended entirely on the trust they placed in him. During these exchanges, Eleanor stayed behind the counter, a silent partner. She was fascinated by the quiet dignity of the Navajo people, the beauty of their language, the love they showed their children, who clung to their mother's skirts with wide, curious eyes. She was an outsider, a pale woman in a world of sun and shadow, but they treated her with a grave, distant courtesy, because Tahoe was there. The isolation of the trading post was broken one afternoon by the arrival of a buckboard from the opposite direction, from Prescott. On the seat were Reverend Miller and his wife, their faces set with pious concern. The Reverend was a thick-set man with a voice accustomed to filling a church, and his wife was a small, bird-like woman who looked at the desert as if it were a personal affront. They had heard, the Reverend boomed, that a decent, church-going woman was living alone in this forsaken place. They had come to offer Christian fellowship and to persuade her to return to civilized society. His gaze fell upon Tahoe, who was sitting on the porch mending a piece of tack, and his expression soured. "My dear Miss Pierce," the Reverend said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial rumble, "it is not right for a woman of your quality to be living unchaperoned, and in the company of that man." Eleanor's spine stiffened. "That man's name is Tahoe. He is my partner in this business." "Partner, Mrs." Miller chirped, her eyes wide with a horror that was not entirely feigned. "But he is a savage. He has shown me more civility than many men I knew in Kansas." "Madam," Eleanor replied, her voice dangerously quiet, "and without him, there would be no business. I intend to stay." The Reverend lectured her on propriety, on her immortal soul, on the rumors that were already spreading through Prescott. A white woman living with an Indian. It was an outrage, an offense against God and decency. Eleanor listened, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She felt the old cage of expectations closing around her, the same cage she had fled Kansas to escape, but this time she refused to be trapped. She thanked them for their concern, told them she was quite capable of managing her own affairs, and showed them the door. They left in a cloud of dust and disapproval, their parting glances promising further trouble. When they were gone, the silence they left behind was heavy. Tahoe had not moved from his spot on the porch, his head bent over his work, but Eleanor knew he had heard every word. The space between them, once so comfortable, was now charged with a new and difficult awareness. Days later, the sky turned a bruised, yellowish gray. The air grew still and heavy, and a strange, oppressive silence fell over the desert. Tahoe looked to the horizon. "A storm is coming," he said. He began securing the shutters, moving with an unhurried efficiency that spoke of long experience. Eleanor helped him, her heart thudding with an unnamed anxiety. The wind came first, a low moan that grew into a howling shriek. Then the sand hit. It came in a solid, blinding wall, blotting out the sun, the sky, the entire world. The trading post was plunged into a suffocating twilight. The sand blasted against the adobe walls, a relentless, scouring assault. It forced its way through every crack, under the door, a fine, gritty powder that coated everything. They were trapped inside. The world reduced to the four walls of the trading post. The roar of the wind was deafening, a physical force that made the very air vibrate. Eleanor lit a lantern, its small flame flickering wildly, casting their elongated shadows onto the walls. The outside world, with its judgments and its rules, was trying to tear its way in. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. Tahoe stood by the window, peering through a small gap in the shutter, his profile a stark silhouette against the raging storm. Eleanor found herself watching him, unable to look away. She watched the solid set of his shoulders, the quiet strength in his stillness. In that moment, the Reverend's warnings seemed like the ravings of a madman. Savage, this man was the calm center of the storm. He was more grounded, more real than anyone she had ever known. A fierce gust of wind slammed against the building, and a shutter tore loose from its upper hinge, banging violently against the wall. Before Eleanor could even cry out, Tahoe moved. He was across the room in an instant, battling the door against the force of the wind, and was out into the blinding chaos. She watched in horror through the doorway as he fought his way through the maelstrom. A shadowy figure wrestling with the broken shutter, the wind tearing at him, trying to rip him away. He managed to secure it, and then he was back inside, slamming the door and barring it, his body covered in a layer of red dust, his black hair wild around his face. He leaned against the door, breathing hard, and looked at her. His dark eyes held the fury of the storm itself, and in their depths, Eleanor saw something else, something that made her own breath catch in her throat, a raw, unguarded intensity, an echo of the same confusing, powerful feeling that was churning inside her. She realized with a terrifying clarity that her attraction to him was not just about his strength or his stark beauty or the safety she felt in his presence. It went deeper. It was the way he looked at her, as if he saw not the spinster from Kansas, but the woman she was becoming. He saw her, and he did not judge, in the heart of the storm, surrounded by the howling rage of the desert. Eleanor Pierce finally admitted the truth to herself. She was falling in love with him. The storm scoured the world clean. When the wind finally died, and the sand settled, a profound silence fell over the desert, broken only by the drip of water from the roof where the rain had found a new way in. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and the air smelled of wet earth and cleansed sage. It felt like the first day of creation. They spent the next 2 days digging themselves out. A dune had drifted against the front of the trading post, burying the porch and pinning the door shut. They had to use the storeroom exit, shoveling the heavy, damp sand until their muscles screamed in protest. Something had shifted between them, something as real and tangible as the newly sculpted landscape. The easy, companionable silence they had shared was gone, replaced by an awareness so acute it was almost painful. Eleanor found she could no longer look at Tahoe directly. Instead, she was conscious of him in other ways. She knew where he was in a room without seeing him, as if he carried his own center of gravity that pulled at her senses. She was aware of the breadth of his shoulders as he lifted a heavy sack, the grace of his movements as he climbed onto the roof to inspect for damage, the low timbre of his voice when he spoke, which he did now even less than before. He, too, seemed to have retreated behind a new wall. His watchfulness, which had once felt protective, now felt like a careful distance. His eyes would meet hers for a fleeting second, and in that instant, She would see a flicker of the storm's intensity before he looked away, his expression becoming shuttered and remote. They were like two planets that had been knocked from their orbits, now circling each other in a new, uncertain pattern, governed by a force they both refused to name. The air between them hummed with unspoken words, with the memory of his body shielding the door, of his eyes holding hers in the heart of the maelstrom. They worked hard, the physical labor a welcome distraction from the tension. They repaired, they cleaned, they rebuilt. The trading post, which had been a place of quiet refuge, now felt small, the walls seeming to press in on them. Eleanor found herself making unnecessary trips to the well, just to be outside in the vast emptiness where she could breathe again. She would stand with the bucket in her hand, staring out at the horizon, her heart a tangled knot of fear and a longing so sharp it was a physical ache. She had acknowledged her love for him to herself, but that knowledge was a dangerous, volatile thing. It had no place in the world, no language it could be spoken in. It was a secret she had to carry alone, and it was heavier than any bucket of water. The evenings were the most difficult. After a simple meal of beans and coffee, the lengthening shadows would drive them inside. The single lantern would be lit, casting its familiar golden circle of light. But the space no longer felt cozy. It felt charged, like the air before a lightning strike. Eleanor would try to read, her eyes scanning the same page over and over without comprehension. Tahoe would sit by the cold hearth, sharpening a knife or oiling a piece of leather, his focus so absolute he seemed to have forgotten she was even there. But she knew he had not. His stillness was a conscious act, a form of defense. She could feel him holding himself back, and it made her want to weep. One evening, nearly a week after the storm, Eleanor was cleaning the last of the storm's debris from the main room. A lantern globe had been cracked in the chaos, and she had set it aside on a high shelf. Now, reaching for it, her fingers clumsy with fatigue, she misjudged the distance. The fragile glass slipped, and she instinctively tried to catch it. A sharp, searing pain shot through her left hand. She cried out, a small, involuntary sound, and pulled her hand back. A shard of glass had laid her palm open. Blood, dark and shockingly red in the lantern light, welled up instantly, dripping onto the floorboards. Tahoe was on his feet before the second drop hit the floor. He crossed the room in 2 silent strides, his previous lethargy vanishing as if it had never been. "Let me see," he commanded, his voice low and urgent. He took her wrist, his grip firm but gentle, and turned her hand toward the light. His touch sent a jolt through her, a current of heat that had nothing to do with her injury. The cut was deep, a clean, straight line that gaped when he gently probed the edges. "It needs to be cleaned well," he said, his eyes focused on the wound. "And stitched, maybe." The glass was not clean. He looked up and met her gaze, and for the first time in days, the wall was gone. His eyes were clear and dark, and filled with a raw concern that made her heart contract. He led her to a chair at the table, as if she were a child. "Sit, do not move." He moved with quiet purpose, fetching the basin of water, the clean rags she always kept ready, and a small leather pouch she had never seen before. He knelt before her, placing the basin on the floor. He had been working outside until dusk, and in the heat of the evening had shed his shirt. His chest and shoulders, burnished by the sun and the lantern light, were a landscape of lean, hard muscle. He smelled of clean sweat and the dry desert air. He took her hand again, resting it on his knee, and began to clean the wound. His touch was incredibly delicate. His calloused fingers, so strong and capable, moved with a surgeon's precision, washing away the blood. His gaze intent on his task. Eleanor watched his bent head, the way his long black hair fell forward, obscuring his face. She watched the play of muscle in his back as he worked. Every part of her was aware of their proximity, of the heat radiating from his body, of the simple, shocking intimacy of the moment. She had tended to him in his weakness. Now he was tending to her. The reversal was profound, a shifting of a balance she had not even realized existed. He drew a fine needle and some kind of thin, dark thread from his leather pouch. "This will hurt," he said, his voice soft, apologetic. He did not look at her as he spoke, keeping his focus on her hand. She simply nodded, unable to speak. She braced herself for the sting of the needle, but as he prepared to make the first stitch, her free hand, acting on an impulse she did not understand and could not control, rose. She needed to steady herself, to hold on to something. She needed to touch him. Her fingers came to rest on his chest, just over his heart. The skin was warm, smooth, alive. Beneath her hand, she could feel the slow, solid beat of his heart. It was the steadiest thing she had ever felt in her life. Her touch was light, tentative, a question asked without words. He went completely still. The needle paused just above her skin. His breath hitched, a barely audible sound. For a long moment, he did not move, did not breathe. Then, very slowly, he raised his head. His eyes found hers, and the world seemed to fall away. There was no trading post, no desert, no lantern casting flickering shadows. There was only the space between them, a space so charged with unspoken feeling that the air itself felt thick. Her fingers, still resting on his chest, traced a small, unconscious circle. They brushed against the raised silver line of a scar, a pale crescent just below his collarbone. It was an old wound, long healed, but she could feel the story of it beneath her fingertips, the memory of violence and pain. This was him. Not just the quiet, strong man who fixed her corral and translated for her, but a man who had been wounded, who had survived. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, a sad, knowing, gentle thing. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low murmur, a sound meant only for her, softer than a whisper yet as clear as a bell. "Careful, Darlin," he said. "That's where you live now." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. Her breath caught in her throat. He was not talking about the scar. He was talking about his heart, the heart that was beating so steadily beneath her hand. It was a confession, a declaration, an invitation. He was telling her that this space, this vital, protected center of his being, was hers, that she had, without either of them planning it, taken up residence there. A single tear welled in her eye and traced a hot path down her cheek. She did not know what to say, what to do. The truth of his words resonated so deeply within her that it felt like a homecoming. Yes, that was where she lived. And in that same moment, she knew with absolute certainty that her own heart had found its place, there in the warm, solid strength of him. He held her gaze for another long moment, his dark eyes searching hers, seeing everything, seeing the truth she could no longer hide. Then, the moment shattered. The intensity in his eyes was banked, the shutters coming down once more. His expression became carefully neutral, with his customary efficiency. He returned his attention to her hand and began to stitch the wound, his movements quick and precise. The sting of the needle was a distant, secondary pain. He finished his work, bandaging her hand with clean linen strips. His touch was now impersonal, professional. He stood up, putting a careful, deliberate distance between them. "Keep it clean," he said, his voice flat, all the warmth gone from it. He turned and walked to the far side of the room, picked up a saddle he had been mending, and sat with his back to her. The silence that fell was a new and terrible kind. It was not the silence of companionship, nor the silence of tension. It was the silence of fear. They had stepped across a line, had spoken a truth so profound and so dangerous that the only possible response was to retreat as far away from it as possible. They had seen into each other's hearts, and the sight had terrified them both. The fragile bridge between their two worlds had been built, but neither of them had the courage to cross it. The days that followed were a torment of polite distance. They moved around each other with a careful, measured grace that was more intimate than any touch. Every shared task, every necessary word, was fraught with the memory of her hand on his chest, of his low, devastating confession. He had named the thing that had grown between them, and now that it had a name, it was a wild creature they were both afraid to look at directly. Eleanor buried herself in her ledger, the neat columns of figures a comforting, tangible reality. She calculated profits that did not exist and ordered her small world with an ink pen, while the true, chaotic state of her heart went unrecorded. Tahoe spent his days outside, disappearing for hours at a time, returning with a rabbit for their dinner or with his hands smelling of horse and leather. He was building a wall of activity, of physical exertion, and she was building one of ink and paper. The world outside the trading post, however, had not forgotten them. The rumors the Reverend had warned of had taken root in the thin, parched soil of Prescott and had grown into something ugly and twisted. They came on a hot, merciless afternoon. 4 of them on horseback, their faces hard and bearded, their eyes narrowed against the glare of the sun. They were not townsfolk, but prospectors or ranchers, men who lived by a harder, simpler code of suspicion and force. They rode not with the casual air of customers, but with the grim purpose of a posse. Their leader, a tall man with a stained duster and cruel, pale eyes, dismounted and swaggered onto the porch. Tahoe, who had been sitting in the shade repairing a bridle, rose slowly to his feet. He did not speak, but his stillness was a challenge, a silent claim to the ground he stood on. "You, the woman?" the man asked, his eyes dismissing Tahoe and fixing on Eleanor, who had come to the doorway. "I am Eleanor Pierce," she said, her voice steady despite the hammering in her chest. "This is my trading post." "We heard you was keeping a pet Navajo out here," the man said, a smirk twisting his lips. He spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. "We got business with him." "Tahoe is my partner," Eleanor said, the words tasting of defiance. The man laughed. "A short, ugly bark. Partner. That what you call it?" His gaze flicked to Tahoe. "There's been trouble up by the Verde River. An army supply wagon hit. Apaches, some say. But others say Navajo tracks were found. Tracks of a man wearing army boots." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She knew Tahoe had served as a scout. She had seen the worn boots he sometimes wore. "He spies for them." Another man on horseback chimed in, his voice full of self-righteous certainty. "Sits here, learns the comings and goings, then reports back to his kind." "That is a lie," Eleanor said, stepping fully onto the porch, positioning herself slightly in front of Tahoe. "He has not left this place in weeks." "And you'd tell us if he had," the leader sneered. "You, living out here in sin with a redskin." The insult struck her with physical force. But before she could retort, Tahoe spoke. His voice was quiet, yet it cut through the hot, tense air. "I have killed more Apache than you have ever seen. White man, I have scouted for your soldiers. Your fight is not my fight." "It is now," the leader said, his hand dropping to the pistol at his hip. "We're taking you to the fort at Prescott. They can sort it out. We ain't having no spy living this close to decent folk." The situation was spiraling out of control, the raw, unthinking hatred of the men an almost palpable force. They began to advance, spreading out to surround the porch. One of them, clumsy in his aggression, backed into a crate where Eleanor kept a spare lantern. It tilted, fell, and the glass globe shattered on the dry wooden planks of the porch. Kerosene splashed out, a dark, spreading stain. Another man, either through malice or sheer stupidity, tossed his cigar butt down. The flames erupted with a hungry whoosh. The dry sun-baked wood of the porch ignited instantly. The fire, fed by the spilled kerosene, raced up the wall of the trading post with a terrifying speed. The men yelled, jumping back from the heat. The confrontation was forgotten, replaced by the primal, chaotic spectacle of the fire. For a moment, Eleanor was frozen, watching in horror as her home, her sanctuary, Her entire world was consumed. Then a desperate clarity seized her. Her ledger, the small metal box with her savings. She turned and ran back into the smoke-filled room, coughing as the acrid fumes filled her lungs. She snatched the box and the book from the counter, her eyes streaming. The heat was immense, the crackle of the flames a deafening roar. When she stumbled back out onto the sand, gasping for clean air, she saw that the men had cornered Tahoe against the corral. Their blood was up, their faces lit by the hellish orange glow of the fire. Their intentions clear. They were no longer planning on taking him to any fort. They were a mob, and they wanted a life. Tahoe stood with a fence post in his hand, his back to the rails, facing the four of them. He was not panicked. His face was a mask of cold, lethal calm. He moved with a warrior's economy, fending off their lunges, but she could see he was tiring, that it was only a matter of time. Something inside Eleanor broke. It was the dam of fear, of propriety, of a lifetime spent being a quiet, sensible woman. She ran to the side of the burning building where Tahoe kept his rifle propped, just inside the door. She grabbed the heavy weapon. It was impossibly solid in her hands. She did not know how to shoot it, did not even know if it was loaded, but they did not know that. "Get away from him," she screamed, her voice raw and torn by smoke. They turned, their eyes wide with surprise at the sight of her, the spinster from Kansas, holding a rifle with a desperate, unwavering aim. The fire roared behind her, framing her in a vision of righteous fury. She was a wild thing, her hair coming loose from its pins, her face smudged with soot, her eyes blazing. The moment of their hesitation was all Tahoe needed. He moved like a striking snake, bringing the fence post down on the knee of the nearest man, who screamed and crumpled. He shoved another back into the leader, and then he was beside her, grabbing her arm. "Come," he said, his voice a low command. "Now." He pulled her away from the inferno, away from the enraged and shocked men. They ran. They plunged into the deepening twilight of the desert, the burning trading post a terrible, beautiful pyre behind them, lighting their way. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs ached, leaving behind the only home they had. They did not stop until the fire was a tiny, flickering star on the horizon. They slowed to a desperate, stumbling walk, moving deeper into the wilderness. The moon rose, a sliver of silver in the ink-black sky, casting the landscape in ghostly relief. They were fugitives, with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a shared, terrible knowledge there was no going back. The desert night grew cold. An hour later, the weather turned. The wind picked up, not with the dry heat of a sandstorm, but with a damp, chilling edge. Dark clouds scudded across the sky, swallowing the moon and the stars. A low rumble of thunder echoed in the distance. Then the rain began. A few fat, cold drops that quickly turned into a driving, icy downpour. They were soaked in minutes, their clothes clinging to them, the cold seeping into their bones. They were exposed, exhausted, and utterly miserable. Tahoe scanned the landscape, his eyes sharp even in the near-total darkness. He spotted a dark shape ahead, a jumble of boulders at the base of a mesa. "There," he said, his voice barely audible over the drumming of the rain. He half carried, half dragged her toward it. They found what they were looking for, a shallow cave, more of a deep overhang, carved into the rock by centuries of wind and water. It was not much, but it was shelter. They collapsed inside, huddling together at the back of the small space, away from the driving rain. They were shivering uncontrollably, their teeth chattering. The adrenaline had faded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion and a stark, terrifying fear. They had lost everything. They were being hunted. They could die out here from the cold alone. In the darkness of the cave, all the walls they had built between them were gone. There was no pretense left, no room for polite distance. There was only the cold, the dark, and the trembling of their own bodies. Eleanor could feel the tremors running through Tahoe's powerful frame. He was as cold and as frightened as she was. Instinctively, they moved closer, seeking the small comfort of shared body heat. She was pressed against his side, her head resting on his shoulder. She could feel the hard muscle of his arm, the solid wall of his chest. He put an arm around her, pulling her tighter against him. It was not a gesture of passion, but of pure, desperate survival. They were two living creatures clinging to each other against the storm. She tilted her head up, trying to see his face in the gloom. She could make out only the strong line of his jaw, the dark shape of him. But she could feel his breath, warm against her cheek. She could feel the frantic beating of his heart. Or perhaps it was her own. "Tahoe," she whispered, her own voice sounding strange and small. He looked down, and she knew he could see her, that his eyes had long adjusted to the dark. He did not speak. There were no words for what lay between them, for the fire and the flight and the fear. There was only this desperate, shivering closeness in a storm-swept cave. He lowered his head, slowly, hesitantly, and then his lips were on hers. It was not a gentle kiss. It was born of desperation and terror, of a need so profound it erased all thought. It was cold and wet from the rain, and tasted of smoke and fear. It was a hungry, frantic claiming, a desperate affirmation of life in the face of oblivion. She kissed him back with all the pent-up longing, all the unspoken love, all the terror of the last few hours. It was a kiss that sealed their fate, a wild, hopeless, beautiful surrender. In the heart of the storm, in the darkness of the earth, they were no longer two separate people, but one single, desperate flame against the cold. The dawn that broke over the storm-washed world was achingly beautiful and cruelly indifferent. Light spilled over the horizon, painting the wet sand in shades of rose and gold. Inside the cave, the cold was a physical presence, a damp ache in their bones. Eleanor awoke first, her body stiff, her cheek pressed against the hard muscle of Tahoe's shoulder. His arm was still around her, a heavy, protective weight. The memory of their desperate kiss returned with a rush, a confusing mixture of shame and a fierce, undeniable rightness. They moved away from each other in the gray morning light, the spell of the night broken. A new, profound awkwardness hung between them. They had shared something primal in the dark, and now, in the unforgiving light of day, they were strangers again, with no map for this new territory. He would not meet her eyes. He rose and went to the mouth of the cave, a silhouette against the brightening sky, his shoulders rigid with a tension that seemed to have settled deep into his soul. They traveled for 2 days, moving southwest, deeper into the vast, empty heart of the desert. Tahoe set a relentless pace, as if trying to outrun the memory of the fire, or perhaps the memory of the cave. He was a different man out here, in the confines of the trading post. He had been a quiet, solid presence. Here, in his own element, he was something more. He read the landscape like a language she could not comprehend, finding water where she saw only dry rock, pointing out the tracks of a coyote, the distant flight of an eagle. He moved with a silent, fluid grace, a part of the wilderness, not a trespasser in it. But his silence was heavier than before, laced with a grimness that frightened her. The light in his eyes, the faint amusement she had sometimes seen, was gone, replaced by a haunted, inward-looking darkness. She knew, with a sinking certainty, that he was leading them to a specific place, a place that was pulling him forward with a grim, magnetic force. On the afternoon of the second day, they crested a low mesa, and he stopped. Below them, nestled in a shallow, wind-scoured canyon, was a scene of utter desolation. It had once been a settlement. The circular, ghostly outlines of several hogans were still visible, but their walls had collapsed, their timber roofs burned away, leaving only scorched and skeletal remains. A few broken pots lay half buried in the sand. The silence was absolute, heavier and more profound than the silence of the empty desert. This was the silence of a graveyard. "What is this place?" she asked softly, though she already knew. "My home," Tahoe said, and the words were stones in his mouth. "Where I was a boy." He started down the slope, and she followed, her heart aching for him. This was the source of his pain, the wound he carried that was far deeper than the gash she had healed on his side. They walked through the ruins, a place of ghosts. Eleanor could almost hear them, the laughter of children, the murmur of women at their looms, the quiet dignity of a people living in harmony with the harsh, beautiful land. Now, there was only the whisper of the wind through the bones of their homes. Tahoe stopped before the largest of the ruined circles. He knelt and touched a blackened stone at what would have been the threshold. His broad back was turned to her, but she could see the rigid line of his spine. The grief held tight in his powerful frame. "My mother was a weaver," he said, his voice a low, rough thing she had to strain to hear. "She would sit here in the sun. Her hands were never still." He paused, his fingers tracing the outline of the fallen stone. "Soldiers came. They said we had broken a treaty we never made. They said our land was needed for others." He looked up then, not at her, but at the empty, indifferent sky. They burned everything. They did not care who was inside. The raw, unadorned horror of his words struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. She saw it all, the smoke, the terror, the senseless, brutal destruction. This was the scar she had felt on his soul. This was the reason for his silence, for his watchfulness, for the deep, abiding sorrow in his eyes. He stood up and finally turned to face her. His expression was one she had never seen before, a mask of cold, hard resolve. The tenderness she had glimpsed, the man who had called her Darlin, was gone, buried beneath a mountain of grief and guilt. "You cannot stay with me, Eleanor," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "The men from the trading post, they will tell the soldiers. They will say I am a spy, a renegade. They will hunt me. And if they find you with me, they will not see a woman. They will only see what he called you, and they will treat you that way." The coldness of his words was a calculated cruelty, designed to push her away, to frighten her into saving herself. "Where would I go?" she asked, her own voice trembling. "Back to Prescott, to face the Reverend and his wife, to live on their charity, their pity." "It is better than being dead," he countered, his jaw tight. "I will take you close to the town. You can tell them I forced you, that you escaped. They will believe you. You can go back east. You can forget this place. Forget me." The finality in his tone, the way he was already erasing himself from her life, was more painful than any fire. He was trying to protect her. She understood that. He was trying to keep the flames that had consumed his family from consuming her as well. But in doing so, he was denying her, denying the truth that had been forged between them. She took a step toward him, her bandaged hand held at her side, her chin lifted in defiance. "I did not leave Kansas because I was looking for safety. Tahoe, I had safety. I had a world of quiet, suffocating safety. I left because I was not alive. I was just waiting to die a little bit each day." She looked around at the ruins, at the stark, brutal beauty of the canyon. "This is real. The fire was real. The storm was real. What I feel for you, that is the most real thing of all, and I will not run from it." She met his gaze, her own eyes clear and unwavering, pouring all the love and conviction she possessed into that single, soul-bearing look. "I did not come this far to be saved," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she never knew she had. "I came to live." Her words hung in the silent air between them, a declaration of faith in a faithless place. She saw the shock in his eyes, the cracking of his cold resolve. He had expected fear, tears, arguments. He had not expected this. He had not expected a strength that mirrored his own. He had seen her as something precious to be protected, and she was showing him she was a warrior in her own right. He took a ragged breath, the sound of a man breaking. He closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, the coldness was gone, replaced by a raw, aching vulnerability that was more intimate than any touch. The fight went out of him, leaving behind only the deep, desperate love he had tried so hard to deny. He did not speak, he simply opened his arms. It was all the invitation she needed. She went to him, closing the distance between them, and wrapped her arms around his waist, pressing her face against the warm, solid wall of his chest. He held her, his arms enfolding her completely, his hand stroking her hair. He held her as if she were the only anchor in a world that had tried to drown him. They stood like that for a long time, two survivors in a field of ghosts, finding solace in the ruins. The sun began to set, bleeding color across the western sky. He led her to a sheltered spot at the back of what was once his mother's hogan, a space protected from the wind by a section of wall that still stood. He laid out the one blanket they had saved from the fire. There, in the fading light, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, they came together. It was not an act of frantic passion like the kiss in the cave. It was slow, hesitant, a sacred and tender exploration. It was awkward and imperfect, a fumbling of tired, grieving bodies and hearts overflowing with a love that had no place in the world. It was a joining that was equal parts pain and solace, a mixing of his deep, silent grief and her fierce, defiant hope. She traced the scars on his body, the old one on his chest and the new one on his side, and it felt like she was healing him with her touch. He undid the pins in her hair, letting it fall around her shoulders, and looked at her as if he were seeing the sun for the first time. Their coming together was a quiet, desperate prayer. It was a rebellion against death, an act of creation in a place of destruction, in the heart of the desolate canyon, under a blanket of stars. They were not a white woman and a Navajo man. They were just a man and a woman, stripped of everything but their shared love and their will to survive. They were planting a seed of life in a land of death, and in the quiet aftermath, holding each other against the cold desert night. Eleanor knew that no matter what happened, she had finally, truly, begun to live. The morning after was a quiet resurrection. The ghosts of the canyon were not gone, but they had made a space for the living. The profound, aching sorrow of the place was now tempered by a fragile, new tenderness. When Eleanor awoke, she was wrapped in the blanket and in the warmth of Tahoe's body, his slow, steady breathing a comforting rhythm against her back. The awkwardness of the cave was a distant memory. The truth of their bodies, of their hearts, had been spoken in the night, and there was no unsaying it. He was awake, watching the first light touch the canyon rim. He turned his head and his eyes met hers, and in their dark depths, she saw not the haunted warrior, but the man who had laid his heart open for her. He raised a hand and gently brushed a stray piece of hair from her cheek, his calloused fingers unbelievably soft against her skin. It was a simple gesture, a quiet claiming that said more than 1,000 words. There was no going back. They both knew it. They had crossed the river of fire, and there was no bridge to the life that had been. Their days took on a new, quiet rhythm, a strange domesticity in the heart of the wilderness. They were fugitives, but for a few precious days, in the isolation of the canyon, they were simply a man and a woman building a life from the ashes. He taught her things she would need to survive, how to read the sun to tell the time, how to find the starchy, edible root of the yucca plant, how to be still, to listen to the desert's subtle language. She, in turn, brought a softness to their harsh existence. She would tell him stories from the books she had read, her voice a low murmur in the evenings as they sat by a small, smokeless fire, and she would watch, fascinated, as a small, rare smile would touch his lips. But the peace was a mirage, a beautiful, shimmering illusion they both knew could not last. The world was still out there. The hunt was on. Tahoe was always watchful, his gaze constantly sweeping the horizon. One afternoon, he climbed to the top of the mesa, motioning for her to stay hidden. He lay flat on the warm rock, a part of the landscape, for over an hour. When he came back down, the grim, hard look had returned to his face, and the brief interlude of peace was over. "Soldiers," he said, his voice clipped. "A patrol of 6, miles to the north, but moving in this direction. They are cutting for sign. They know I would come to the high ground." The cold knot of fear, which had loosened in the past few days, tightened in Eleanor's stomach again. The hunt was real. They had to move. They packed their few belongings, the blanket, the rifle, a small pouch of dried rabbit meat, and left the canyon of ghosts behind them. Turning south toward the sun-scorched plains that stretched toward Mexico. The journey was a blur of heat and thirst and a constant, gnawing fear. They traveled by night when they could, resting during the hottest part of the day in the sparse shade of a rock outcropping or a deep arroyo. Tahoe was relentless, pushing them both to the edge of their endurance. He was a shadow, moving through the landscape with an expertise that was both magnificent and terrifying. He was in his element, but it was an element of flight, of pursuit. Eleanor struggled to keep up, her city-bred body protesting, but she never complained. She would look at his straight back, at the tense set of his shoulders, and she would find a new reserve of strength. She was no longer just running for her life. She was fighting for theirs. One evening, as dusk was settling, painting the sky in violent streaks of purple and orange, they were making their way through a labyrinth of hoodoos, strange rock formations that rose from the desert floor like ancient, petrified giants. Tahoe suddenly stopped, holding up a hand. He melted back into the shadows, his body language signaling an alarm more potent than any shout. Eleanor froze, her heart hammering. A lone rider emerged from between two of the stone pillars. He was a white man, lean and weathered, dressed in buckskin and an old, battered army hat. He rode with an easy, familiar slouch, but the rifle he carried across his saddle was held at the ready. He was not a soldier in a blue uniform, but he had the unmistakable air of one, a scout. Eleanor's first instinct was to run, but Tahoe stepped out from behind a rock, moving into the rider's path. The two men faced each other in the fading light, their stillness a silent, dangerous question. The rider's eyes narrowed, and then a slow look of recognition and of profound relief spread across his face. "Tahoe," the man said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. "I will be damned. I almost shot you." "You would have missed Ezekiel," Tahoe replied, and the faintest hint of their old banter returned. A ghost from another life. The man, Ezekiel, dismounted. He was older than Tahoe, his face a roadmap of sun and hardship, but his eyes were a clear, startling blue. They were the eyes of a man who saw everything. His gaze shifted to Eleanor, taking in her worn dress, her determined face, and the way she stood just behind Tahoe. There was no judgment in his look, only a weary understanding. "I have been tracking you for 3 days," Ezekiel said, turning his attention back to Tahoe. "Came out from Prescott as soon as I heard. I told the captain I was scouting for Apache signs south of the Mogollon Rim. Bought myself some time." Heard what Tahoe asked, though he already knew. "The fire at the trading post. Those prospectors came back with a wild tale. Said you were a renegade, a spy, that you burned the place yourself and took the woman." Ezekiel shook his head, a gesture of disgust. "It was all the excuse they needed. There is a warrant out for your arrest, signed by the commander at Fort Whipple himself, for treason, for rebellion." Treason! The word was a death sentence. Eleanor felt a wave of dizziness. This was worse than she had imagined. They were not just accusing him of being a spy, they were accusing him of waging war. "They want you dead, Tahoe," Ezekiel said, his voice grim. "They do not want a trial, they want a body. I came to tell you to keep riding south. Do not stop until you are deep in Mexico. It is your only chance." The three of them stood in the twilight, the stone giants their only witnesses. The choice was laid bare before them, a life of exile, or a certain death The price of their love was to be hunted for the rest of their days. Tahoe looked at Eleanor. In his eyes, she saw the terrible weight of his past, of the fire that had taken his family, and the certainty that the same injustice was coming for him now. He had no reason to trust the white man's world, no reason to believe in its laws or its mercy. Mexico was the only logical answer. "We will go south," Tahoe said to Ezekiel, but his eyes were on Eleanor. He was making a statement, but he was also asking a question. He was giving her the chance to choose the path of survival. And in that moment, Eleanor saw their future stretching out before them. A life spent in the shadows, always looking over their shoulders, always afraid. A life where their love, the most real and vital thing she had ever known, would be a secret they had to hide like a crime. They would be safe, perhaps, but they would not be free. The cage she had fled in Kansas would simply be a larger one, its bars made of fear instead of propriety. She stepped forward, moving to stand beside Tahoe, not behind him. She looked at Ezekiel, then at the man she loved. "No," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a conviction that startled both men. Tahoe turned to her, a deep line of protest forming between his brows. "Eleanor, you heard him. They will kill me." "They will kill you," she corrected him gently. "And they will kill me, too. Just more slowly. If we run, we are admitting we are guilty. We are letting their lies become our truth. We would spend the rest of our lives hiding from a world that has already judged us. What kind of life is that?" She reached out and took his hand, her fingers lacing through his. "Tahoe, I love you, and because I love you, I will not live in the dark with you. I will not have our life be something we are ashamed of." She looked deep into his eyes, her heart in her throat, praying he would understand. "Think of this place," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, gesturing at the silent, ruined homes in the canyon they had left behind. Their lives were stolen from them. Their truth was burned and buried. If we run, we are burying our own truth. If we have to live hiding forever, then we are already dead. The silence that followed was profound. Ezekiel looked from her face to Tahoe's, his weary expression shifting to one of grudging admiration. Tahoe stood frozen, her words washing over him, dismantling the hard, practical logic of survival he had lived by his entire life. She was not offering him safety. She was offering him something far more dangerous and far more precious. She was offering him honor. She was offering him a chance to fight for the truth of their life together, not on a battlefield with weapons, but in the heart of the world that condemned them. He searched her face, looking for any sign of doubt, of fear. He found none. He found only a love so fierce and a courage so bright that it humbled him. She was not the woman he had sought to protect. She was the woman who was showing him the way. Slowly, a new light dawned in his eyes, chasing away the haunted shadows. The grim line of his mouth softened. He brought her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. "Then we will not die in the dark," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. He looked at Ezekiel. "We are going back to Prescott." The journey back to Prescott was the opposite of Eleanor's first journey west. That had been a flight toward freedom. This was a deliberate march into a cage. Ezekiel rode ahead, his presence a grim sort of safe passage, ensuring they were not shot on sight before they even reached the town. They walked, leading Ezekiel's horse, a small, somber procession against the vast, indifferent landscape. Tahoe's hand rarely left hers. It was not a gesture of comfort, but of solidarity, a silent, shared vow. He was walking back toward a world that had burned his home and murdered his family, and he was doing it for her, for the truth of the life they had started. The weight of that love was a heavier burden than any fear. Their arrival in Prescott created a silent, immediate stir. Doors opened. Faces appeared in windows. People stopped in the middle of the street to stare. The whispers followed them like a trail of dust. There was the woman who had run off with a savage. There was the renegade himself, walking into town as bold as brass. The crowd that gathered was a mixture of the curious, the hostile, and the deeply unnerved. Eleanor held her head high, her gaze fixed forward, drawing strength from the steady pressure of Tahoe's hand. She felt the judgment of 100 eyes, but for the first time in her life, the opinions of others felt small and distant, like the buzz of insignificant flies. The town marshal, a man with a drooping mustache and weary eyes, met them in front of his office. He looked from Ezekiel to Tahoe, his expression one of profound reluctance. He was a man of the law, but he was also a man who knew the temper of his town. This would be trouble. He took Tahoe into custody, his movements almost apologetic. The clang of the jail cell door shutting was the loneliest sound Eleanor had ever heard. Ezekiel found her a room at the boarding house, a small, airless space that smelled of boiled cabbage and lye soap. The landlady, a woman with a face like a clenched fist, took Eleanor's money but looked at her as if she were something unclean. For 3 days, Eleanor was a prisoner in that room, the town's hostility a palpable force outside her window. But she was not idle. She spent the time going over her story, her testimony, not as a performance, but as a clarification of the truth in her own mind. She was not just fighting for Tahoe's life. She was fighting for her own. The trial was held in the town's main hall, a large wooden room that served as a church on Sundays and a dance hall on Saturdays. Today, it served as a crucible. It was packed to the rafters, the air thick with the heat of too many bodies and the sour smell of prejudice. Eleanor sat on a hard bench at the front, with Ezekiel beside her. Tahoe was brought in, his hands shackled. He did not look at her, but she felt his presence like a physical warmth. He stood before the judge, a circuit judge with a tired face and sharp, intelligent eyes, and his dignity was a silent rebuke to the entire proceeding. The prosecutor was a young, ambitious army captain who saw this not as a search for justice, but as an opportunity for advancement. He began by calling the leader of the prospectors to the stand. The man, whose name was Jebediah Smith, swaggered to the front, took the oath, and proceeded to weave a tapestry of lies. He painted Tahoe as a sullen, threatening presence from the very beginning. He claimed Tahoe had started the fire in a fit of rage, trapping them all, and had then abducted Miss Pierce, a helpless, terrified woman. He spoke the words savage and renegade with a self-righteous venom that the jury, a panel of 12 grim-faced ranchers and merchants, seemed to soak up like dry earth drinks rain. Next came the Reverend Miller. He was more subtle, and therefore more dangerous. He spoke of his Christian concern for Miss Pierce's welfare. He described her as a woman of good breeding who had fallen under a dark and powerful influence. He recounted her refusal of his guidance, her stubborn insistence on living in that God-forsaken place with that man. He did not accuse Tahoe of any crime directly, but he painted a picture of Eleanor as a woman who had lost her way, her judgment clouded, her very soul in peril. He made her a victim, not of abduction, but of her own foolish, female weakness. The captain presented his other evidence, the attack on the supply wagon, the testimony of a soldier who had found tracks made by army boots near the scene. It was all smoke, all insinuation, but in the stuffy, charged atmosphere of the courtroom, it began to take the shape of a hangman's noose. Then the captain called Eleanor to the stand. A hush fell over the room. This was the spectacle they had all come to see, the fallen woman. She walked to the front, her back straight, her steps measured. She took the oath, her voice clear and steady. Tahoe watched her, and for the first time, a flicker of something fear, hope, a terrible vulnerability showed in his guarded eyes. The captain began with a tone of patronizing sympathy. He asked her if she had been afraid, if the defendant had threatened her, if she had gone with him willingly. "I did not go with him, Captain," Eleanor said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "We fled together." She then began to speak, not just answering his questions, but telling the truth. She described the men's arrival, their accusations, their aggression. She told the court how Jebediah Smith and his companions had backed Tahoe against the corral, how they had been the ones to start the fire, through their own drunken carelessness. "They speak of fire," she said, her gaze sweeping over the jury. "But they were the ones who brought the spark. They speak of threats, but they were the ones who came with menace in their hearts and pistols on their hips." She turned her attention to the Reverend. "Reverend Miller speaks of my soul. I will tell you about my soul. In Kansas, my soul was in a small, neat box, tied with the ribbons of propriety and expectation. I was told what to think, how to feel, who to be. It was a safe life, and it was no life at all. When I came to this territory, I came seeking a place where I could breathe. At the trading post my uncle left me, I found it." She looked directly at Tahoe then, a public declaration that was more intimate than any whisper. This man, Tahoe, did not threaten me. He helped me. He worked beside me. He was honest and fair in all his dealings. He showed me a kindness and an honor that I had seldom seen in the civilized world I left behind. He was wounded when I found him. My uncle, a good man, had saved his life once before. I did what any decent human being would have done. I cared for him." The prosecutor tried to interrupt, but the judge waved him to silence, his tired eyes now alert and focused. The room was utterly still. "You have heard testimony about army boots," Eleanor continued, her voice ringing with passion. "Yes, Tahoe served as a scout for the army. He fought for you. He bled for you. And when his service was done, you cast him out. You speak of him as a spy, a traitor. I will tell you what he is. He is a man whose people were slaughtered, whose home was burned to the ground by the very soldiers he once served. And despite that, he has never raised a hand in anger against an innocent man. The anger in that trading post was not his. It belonged to Mr. Smith and his friends, men who see a man with dark skin and immediately assume he is a criminal." Tears were now streaming down her face, but she did not let her voice break. "You wish to judge our life together, then judge it. He is a man. I am a woman. We took a ruined place and we made it a home. We took the distrust between two peoples and we built a small bridge of commerce and respect. We took our own loneliness, and we found solace in each other. If that is a crime, then I am guilty of it. If that is treason, then my heart is a traitor. But if justice has any meaning in this room, you will see the truth. The only crime committed that day was the crime of hatred, and that crime was not ours." She finished, her chest heaving, her words hanging in the stunned silence. She had not just defended Tahoe. She had put the entire town, with its petty gossip and its deep-seated bigotry, on trial. The judge looked at the jury. "You have heard the testimony," he said, his voice heavy. "There is no direct evidence linking the defendant to the raid on the supply wagon. There is only the conflicting testimony of witnesses regarding the events at the trading post. You will consider the facts, and only the facts." The jury filed out. The wait was an agony. Eleanor could not bring herself to look at Tahoe. She had laid her heart bare for all to see, and she did not know if it had been enough. An hour passed, then two. Finally, the jury returned, their faces unreadable. The foreman, a stout, grim-faced blacksmith, stood up. He cleared his throat. "On the charge of treason and rebellion," he said, his voice booming in the silent room, "we, the jury, find the defendant not guilty." A collective gasp went through the crowd. The foreman added, almost as an afterthought, "On account of there being insufficient evidence." It was not an absolution. It was an acquittal on a technicality. But it was life. It was freedom. The marshal unlocked Tahoe's shackles. He stood, rubbing his wrists, and for the first time, he turned and looked at Eleanor. His eyes filled with a love and a gratitude so profound it took her breath away. They walked out of the courthouse together, into the harsh afternoon sun. The crowd parted for them, their faces a mixture of disbelief, resentment, and a grudging, confused respect. The silence was thick, a wall of unspoken thoughts. They had won in the courtroom, but they had not won here, on the dusty street. As they reached the bottom of the steps, a movement at the edge of the crowd caught Eleanor's eye. A Navajo family, a man, a woman, and two small children had been watching the entire proceeding from a distance. The woman met Eleanor's gaze, her face a mask of dignified composure. She gave her small daughter a gentle push forward. The little girl, who could not have been more than 6 years old, walked hesitantly toward Eleanor. She was shy, her dark eyes huge in her small face. She did not speak. She simply held out her hand. In her palm lay a simple bracelet, a thin strip of leather threaded with polished stones of brilliant, sky-blue turquoise. Eleanor knelt so she was at eye level with the child. She held out her own hand, the one with the pale, thin scar Tahoe had stitched. The little girl gently took her hand and slipped the bracelet onto her wrist. The blue of the stone was a shock of vibrant life against her pale skin. The child gave her a shy, fleeting smile, then turned and ran back to her mother's side. Eleanor stood up, her eyes meeting the mother's once more. The woman gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture of profound meaning. It was not just thanks. It was acceptance. It was a welcome. In the eyes of his people, she was no longer the white woman. She was one of them. She belonged. Tahoe came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers. He looked at the bracelet, then at her face. He did not need to ask what had happened. He knew. They stood together on the street in Prescott, free but still outcasts, surrounded by a hostile world. But on Eleanor's wrist was a circle of blue, a promise of a different kind of home, a different kind of belonging, and for the first time since the fire, the future did not feel like a threat, but like a place they would build together. A year can be a lifetime. A year can be the turning of a page or the writing of an entirely new book. For Eleanor and Tahoe, it was both. The ground where the trading post had burned was not left barren. From the ashes, something new had risen, built not just with fresh adobe and sturdy timber, but with a stubborn and resilient hope. The new Two Coyotes trading post was larger than the old one, with a wide, welcoming porch and sturdy shutters that could be barred against any storm, natural or human. It stood not as a fortress, but as an invitation, a quiet testament to the will of the two people who called it home. It was no longer just a place of commerce. It had become a crossroads. On any given day, the quiet air would be filled with a mixture of languages. Navajo families would arrive on horseback or in wagons, their quiet dignity a familiar and welcome sight. They would unroll blankets of breathtaking color and design on the porch, their patterns telling stories older than the territory itself. They brought silver and turquoise, pottery and baskets. In return, they left with sacks of flour, tins of coffee, and bolts of bright calico cloth. Miners and prospectors from the hills, men who had once looked at Tahoe with suspicion, now traded with him. Their initial prejudice slowly eroded by his unwavering fairness and his quiet, unshakable integrity. They came for his goods, but they also came for his knowledge of the land, for his advice on which water holes were dry and where the game had moved. He had become a necessary man, a bridge between two worlds that had for so long only known how to meet in conflict. Eleanor moved through this new world with a grace and confidence that the girl from Kansas would not have recognized. She was no longer a visitor here. She was its heart. The Arizona sun had burnished her skin, and the hard work had strengthened her body. Her hands, once soft and pale, were now capable and sure. She managed the ledger with a keen eye, her neat script recording the flow of life through their small outpost. But her true domain was the human one. She knew the names of the Navajo children, had a kind word for the lonely prospectors, and could bargain with a sharp-eyed rancher with a gentle firmness that always left him feeling he had gotten the better end of the deal, even when he had not. The turquoise bracelet was a permanent fixture on her wrist, a constant, beautiful reminder of the day she had found her true people. And now, There was a new life stirring within her. She was 6 months with child, her condition a soft, gentle rounding of her figure that seemed to fill their small home with an even greater sense of purpose. This child, their child, would be born of two worlds, a living symbol of the bridge they had built. It was a terrifying and profoundly joyful prospect. She would often rest a hand on her belly and feel the faint, fluttering kick, a secret message from a future she had never dared to dream of. The most radical transformation, however, had taken place not in the trading post itself, but in the small, sturdy shed they had built beside it. Every afternoon, for 2 hours, the shed became a schoolhouse. This was Tahoe's domain, and it was here that Eleanor saw the truest measure of the man she loved. He had taken the gift of letters that her father had so prized, a gift from her world, and he was sharing it with his, but he was also sharing the wisdom of his own people. The students were a motley collection of 5 Navajo children and the 2 young sons of a homesteader who lived a few miles down the creek. Tahoe would sit on a low stool, and the children would gather around him on the floor. He taught them their letters, how to form the strange, angular shapes that made up English words, his large, calloused hand guiding a small one as it clutched a piece of charcoal. But he also told them the stories of his people, the stories of the creation, of Coyote, the trickster, of the sacred mountains. He taught them the names of the plants, the habits of the animals, the way to read the sky. He was teaching them to survive not just in one world, but in both. It was a quiet, revolutionary act, a weaving together of 2 different kinds of knowledge into something new and strong. Eleanor would often stand in the doorway and watch, her heart so full it felt as if it might burst. She would see the fierce concentration on the face of a small Navajo girl as she spelled out her name, and she would see the wonder in the eyes of the homesteader's boy as Tahoe explained how the hawk finds its prey. This was the future. This small, dusty room was the most hopeful place on earth. One warm summer evening, long after the last customer had departed and the sun had sunk below the horizon in a blaze of glory, they sat together on the porch. The day's heat was finally bleeding out of the earth, and a cool breeze whispered down from the high mesas. A symphony of crickets played in the twilight, and the first stars were beginning to prick the deep, velvet canopy of the sky. The trading post was quiet, a small island of light and peace in the vast, sleeping desert. Eleanor leaned her head against Tahoe's shoulder, her hand resting on the swell of her belly. He had his arm around her, his thumb gently stroking her arm. They did not need to speak. Their silence was a language now, rich with shared history and a deep, abiding comfort. They had faced down the worst of the world, and they had won. Not by defeating it, but by refusing to let its hatred become their own. They had chosen to build instead of to burn, to love instead of to fear. She thought of the girl she had been, the one who had arrived in this land so full of trepidation and a desperate, unformed longing. She had thought freedom was a place you could run to. She had learned, in the heart of the fire and the storm, that freedom was something you built inside yourself, something you had to be willing to fight for, to bleed for. She shifted, turning to face him in the deepening twilight. The light from the lantern in the doorway cast his face in warm relief, highlighting the strong lines of his cheekbones, the gentle curve of his mouth. She raised her hand, the one with the turquoise bracelet, and placed it on his chest, flat against his heart. She could feel its slow, steady rhythm beneath her palm, a beat as constant and as true as the turning of the earth. Her fingers brushed against the faint, silver line of the old scar. A soft smile touched her lips. She looked into his dark, loving eyes and whispered the words that had become the creed of her heart. She told him that this was where she lived now. He did not hesitate. The haunted look was gone forever, replaced by a deep, quiet joy that seemed to emanate from the very center of his being. He brought his hand up to cover hers, pressing it gently against his chest. A slow, beautiful smile spread across his face, a smile that held all the storms they had weathered, all the peace they had found. He told her, his voice a low, warm murmur that was for her and her alone, that it always was. Darlin, it always was. Thank you so much for listening to the story. We would love for you to comment with where you are listening from, so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel Wild West Tales, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.